Kale's prison was cold, dark, and unyielding. The walls of the stone cell seemed to close in on him every time he took a breath. The damp air clung to his skin, the faint smell of mold and decay creeping into his nostrils. His body ached from years of abuse, his limbs stiff and sore from constant labor and the fights that kept him alive. He had been a warrior once, strong and defiant, but now he was just a shadow of himself, chained and broken by the savage beasts who had captured him. The Beastkin, as they were called, had no mercy for humans. To them, he was no more than an animal to be used, a tool to satisfy their needs. Kale had been subjected to their cruelty for so long that the anger and hatred that once burned inside him had cooled into something far more dangerous: despair. He had stopped fighting, stopped hoping. The idea of escape seemed laughable now, a futile dream that had long since faded into the recesses of his mind. The only things that kept him going were the rare moments of contact with the outside world, brief glimpses of the moonlight when the guards didn't bother to lock his cell door, or the sounds of the other captives, their voices muffled but still a reminder that there was more to life than this forsaken cage. But tonight, something was different. Kale had been lying on the cold stone floor, staring up at the ceiling, lost in his own thoughts when he heard the familiar footsteps of the guards approaching. He tensed instinctively, ready for whatever punishment or task they had in mind for him today. The iron bars of his cell creaked as they opened, and Kale's heart beat a little faster, though his expression remained unreadable. But it wasn't one of the usual guards who stepped into the room. It was her, Reyna, the alpha of the Beastkin tribe, the one they all feared and revered. Tall, with the grace of a predator, her wolf-like features were sharp and striking. Her fur, dark as night, rippled with every movement, and her amber eyes gleamed with a mixture of cold authority and something else, something that Kale couldn't quite place. She had never looked at him like this before. He stood, his muscles protesting, but his instincts told him not to kneel. Reyna was a force to be reckoned with. She towered over him, even when he was standing, her presence commanding the air in the room. "Rise," she said, her voice low and smooth, though there was an edge to it. It wasn't a command, not exactly. It was more like a suggestion, as if she were offering him a choice he could not refuse. Kale stood his ground, watching her warily. He had no idea what she wanted this time, but he wasn't about to show weakness. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, the question more a statement than anything. Reyna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, as though she were assessing him, weighing something in her mind. Kale fought the urge to recoil, his body still trained to distrust everything about her kind. But there was something in her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty, almost a vulnerability, that made his heart skip a beat. "You've been here a long time," she said finally, her voice softer than he expected. "Longer than most. I've watched you, human. You're different from the others. You've survived, and yet you've never begged, never submitted." Kale's jaw clenched. The last thing he wanted to hear from her was some twisted praise for his endurance. "What's your point?" he shot back, trying to sound defiant. Reyna's eyes hardened. "You don't understand. I'm not interested in your defiance. Not anymore." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but the intensity of it made his pulse race. "I need you," she said, her words catching him off guard. "I need you to show me something that I cannot find in any other way." Kale's confusion must have shown on his face because she didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her scent, a mixture of wild earth and something undeniably feminine, surrounding him. "Please," Reyna whispered, almost pleading. "I've been a leader for so long. My tribe looks to me for strength, but I've lost something. I've forgotten what it means to be vulnerable. I need you to help me remember." Kale froze, not knowing what to say. Was this a trick? Was this some new form of manipulation to break him? He had seen the way the Beastkin used their power to bend others to their will. They were not like humans. They had no need for compassion or empathy, only strength. But something in her eyes told him this was different. This wasn't a game. Reina wasn't trying to break him. She was asking for something she couldn't find within herself. I need you, she repeated, her voice low and trembling. I need to feel something human, something real. Please. Kale's mind raced, the words sinking into him like a weight he couldn't shake off. He had spent years learning to shut off his emotions, to block out everything that didn't help him survive. But this was a different kind of pressure. A pressure that came from the quiet, raw need in her voice. He wanted to push her away, to remind her of her cruelty, her role in his captivity. But when he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a flicker of something deep inside her, something lonely and lost. Her head tilted, and her gaze softened as she stepped even closer. The air between them crackled with tension. She was powerful, but in this moment, she was vulnerable in a way that both frightened and fascinated him. And then, without another word, she raised her hand, gently touching his arm. It wasn't a gesture of dominance or control. It was a simple touch, soft and tentative, as if she were testing the waters. Kale could feel the heat of her touch seep into his skin, and despite himself, his breath caught in his throat. There was a longing in her, a desperation that was both foreign and familiar to him. He looked at her, his mind spinning, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt something else, something he couldn't define. Reina's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again. Please, I need you to show me how to be human again. The weight of her words hung in the air between them, thick and undeniable. And though every instinct in him screamed to refuse, something in him, something buried deep within his chest, whispered back. All right, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I'll help you. Reina's eyes widened, as if she hadn't expected him to agree so quickly. But before she could say anything else, the door to his cell creaked open again. Both of them tensed, instinctively pulling away from each other. The moment had ended. The tension still lingered, but it was clear now. Everything was about to change. Kale knew it, and so did Reina. The following day, Kale could barely sleep. His mind kept racing, replaying the events of the previous night over and over. He hadn't expected Reina to appear in his cell, nor had he expected her to ask him for something so intimate. The memory of her touch lingered on his skin, making him uneasy in ways he couldn't fully explain. He had agreed to help her, but now that the reality of the situation was sinking in, he wasn't so sure what that meant. What had she meant by her words? She needed him to show her how to be human again. Was it a request for something deeper than what he could provide? The notion unsettled him, but there was also a part of him that felt the weight of her desperation, the vulnerability in her voice. For all her strength, for all her dominance over the tribe, Reina was not invulnerable. Kale had seen that in her eyes, the rawness beneath the cool exterior. The day dragged on as he tried to shake off the feeling of her presence, but it clung to him like a shadow. The usual routine resumed: work, harsh words from the guards, and the constant tension of his captivity. But now, there was something else beneath it all. The question that kept coming back to him was whether he had made the right choice. By nightfall, he had his answer. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway outside his cell, and he tensed instinctively. He had been waiting for her return, even if he wasn't entirely sure why. There was a strange sense of inevitability in the air, like something had already been set into motion that could not be stopped. When the door creaked open, Reina stepped inside, her gaze immediately locking onto his. She didn't say a word, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her eyes. She moved toward him with a purposeful grace, her presence commanding the space between them. Are you ready? She asked, her voice low and steady, but there was an edge to it that Kale couldn't ignore. He stood silently for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides. What was he supposed to do now? He wasn't even sure what she was asking of him, beyond what she had already said, but there was no turning back. She had come to him and he had agreed. Ready for what? He finally asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Reina didn't answer directly. Instead, She stepped closer, the air between them thick with tension. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his tattered tunic, and Kale felt the heat of her touch. He flinched, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something deeper. She took another step forward, and this time Kale didn't move away. He didn't know why, but something inside him was pulling him toward her, making it harder to resist. The rules that had governed his life for so long seemed to lose their meaning in this moment. I need you to understand, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. What I ask of you, it's not just for me, it's for both of us. I need you to help me break free of the chains I've placed on myself. I can't do this alone. Kale's heart pounded in his chest, and he fought the urge to step back. He had never been the kind of man to give in to anything without a fight, but there was something in her words, something raw and genuine, that made him hesitate. You're asking for something you can't have, he said, his voice quieter now. You can't expect me to just give you what you want. I'm not that kind of man. Raina's eyes flickered with something like pain, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She didn't pull away, though. Instead, she reached up and placed a hand on his chest, her fingers warm against his skin. I'm not asking for your submission, she said, her voice steady. I'm asking for something more than that, something that neither of us has ever experienced. I need to feel something real, something that doesn't come with a price tag. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Kale swallowed, unsure of how to respond. Was she asking for him to teach her to be vulnerable? To show her what it meant to feel something without the weight of power and control? He didn't know if he could do that, if he was capable of giving her what she needed. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw that same desperation, that same raw need. And for a moment, he felt a flicker of something inside him, a spark of empathy, of understanding. Maybe it wasn't just her who needed this. Maybe he did too. He raised a hand and placed it over hers, feeling the warmth of her touch. There was no turning back now. Whatever this was between them, it had already begun. All right, he said softly. I'll help you, but only if you promise me one thing. Raina's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't pull away. What's that? Promise me that you'll never forget that you're still in control, he said. This isn't about me controlling you or you controlling me. It's about both of us letting go together. For a long moment, Raina said nothing. She simply stared at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read his thoughts. Then slowly she nodded. I promise, she said, her voice barely audible. The tension between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by something else, something deeper. Raina stepped back, her eyes never leaving his, and Kale could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken understanding between them. She turned toward the door and paused, looking over her shoulder at him. I'll be waiting for you, human. Don't take too long. Kale watched her leave, his heart still pounding in his chest. There was no denying it now. Something had changed between them. The lines between captor and captive had blurred, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. As the door closed behind her, Kale sank back down onto the stone floor, his mind spinning. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what would happen when they crossed that line? He didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, he was afraid of what might come next. The days that followed were tense, charged with a kind of anticipation that neither Kale nor Raina dared to speak of directly. Kale went through the motions of his captivity, his work, his forced chores, but his thoughts never strayed far from the conversation they had shared. The promise they had made to each other echoed in his mind. No control, only letting go together. The very idea unsettled him. It was so different from everything he had known. He had survived by keeping his emotions in check, by holding tight to the belief that if he was always on guard, always in control, he would never have to face the kind of vulnerability Raina had asked him to embrace. And yet, despite his doubts, he couldn't ignore the growing curiosity, the strange pull between them. Raina, for her part, was as distant as ever in the days that followed, but Kale could feel the change in her when she did approach. The touch of her hand against his arm, her gaze that lingered longer than it should, even the way she watched him from a distance. There was something different in it. She had asked for his help and he had agreed. But Kale could see that she was struggling with the idea as much as he was. She, too, seemed unsure of what would come next, but her need, her desperation, was palpable, and it only made the tension between them more intense. It wasn't until one particular evening that things shifted again. Kale had been staring out of the small barred window in his cell, watching the last vestiges of sunlight fade into twilight, when the door opened. He turned, already expecting it to be one of the guards. But instead it was Reyna. She stepped inside without a word, closing the door softly behind her. Her usual confident, commanding presence was still there, but something else lingered beneath it, an uncertainty that Kale hadn't seen before. She moved toward him slowly, as if carefully considering each step, her amber eyes never leaving his face. "You're here," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, but something about the moment felt significant. Reyna gave a small nod, her gaze never faltering. There was a weight to her presence now, a tension that clung to the air between them like a thick fog. "I need you," she said again, but her voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. "Tonight, I need you to show me what it means to be human, what it means to feel something that isn't just a function of power." I don't know how else to explain it. Kale swallowed, unsure of what to say. The pull he felt toward her was stronger than ever, but it was also mixed with fear of the unknown, of stepping into a place where there was no clear boundary between captor and captive, between strength and weakness. He wasn't sure what she wanted from him, or if he could give it to her. Reyna stepped closer, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She didn't reach out, didn't touch him immediately, but Kale could feel the change in the air as she closed the distance between them. The space between them had never felt so heavy, so thick with unspoken words. "I don't know what I'm asking for," she admitted, her voice low, almost vulnerable. "But I know I can't do this alone. I've been a leader for so long, but I've never let anyone in. Not really. And now, I can't stand the emptiness anymore." Kale's chest tightened as her words sank in. He had never heard Reyna speak like this before. She was always so certain, so sure of herself. To hear her voice laced with doubt, with something akin to fear, made him realize just how much she had been holding inside. He could see the struggle in her eyes. The fierce, independent leader who had always been in control, now facing a side of herself that she couldn't ignore. And somehow, despite all the hatred he had for what the Beastkin had done to him, he felt a strange pull to help her. "I'll help you," he said softly, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop them. "But only if you promise me something." Reyna tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she regarded him. "What's that?" "Promise me that you'll let me in," he said, his voice steady despite the tremble of uncertainty in his chest. "Promise me that when we do this, we'll both be honest. No games, no lies. Just honesty. I can't help you if you don't let me see the real you." Reyna's eyes softened as she regarded him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally she nodded. "I promise," she whispered. It was all the confirmation Kale needed. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a lock of hair from her face. The simple touch was enough to send a shiver down his spine, and he could see that it affected her as well. Reyna's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, as though savoring the contact. When she opened them again, her gaze was softer, more open than he had ever seen it. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me what it means to feel again." Kale's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for her again, this time with more confidence. He cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head slightly as he brought his lips closer to hers. For a moment he hesitated, wondering if this was the right thing to do, if this was what she truly wanted. But then he saw the trust in her eyes, the vulnerability that she had hidden so carefully behind her mask of strength. And with that, the last of his hesitation fell away. Their lips met, gentle at first, a soft exploration of something neither of them had ever known. Raina's hand reached up to touch his chest, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the lines of his shirt. The simple contact sent a jolt of heat through Kale's body, and he deepened the kiss, pulling her closer. Raina responded in kind, her body pressing against his, the warmth of her skin sending a wave of sensation through him. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet understanding between them that this moment, this simple human connection, was what they both needed. When they finally broke the kiss, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Kale's heart was racing, and he could feel Raina's pulse beating in time with his own. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes and leaned into him, her body trembling just slightly. Kale could feel the vulnerability in her touch, the way she was allowing herself to be held, to be human. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kale didn't feel like a captive anymore. He felt free. But as they stood there, caught in the warmth of the moment, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something neither of them were prepared for. The door to his cell creaked open again, and they both stiffened, breaking apart quickly. The moment was over, but the question of what came next still lingered, thick and unresolved. The door creaked open, pulling Kale and Raina out of the fragile bubble they had formed around themselves. Both of them stiffened, instinctively pulling back from each other as the heavy footsteps of a guard echoed through the dimly lit hall. Raina turned sharply, her expression hardening in an instant. Her usual commanding presence returned, as though nothing had transpired between them. Kale's heart was still pounding in his chest, the kiss lingering on his lips, but he knew better than to act on it now. Not with the guard standing in the doorway, looking at them with suspicion. "Is everything all right in here, my lady?" The guard's voice was cold, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity in his eyes. He had no idea what had just taken place between Kale and Raina, and for that, Kale was grateful. Raina straightened, wiping any sign of softness from her expression as she turned her gaze to the guard. "Everything is fine. Leave us." Her voice was firm, though there was a brief flicker of something darker beneath the surface, something the guard noticed. The guard hesitated, his gaze darting between the two of them before he nodded, stepping back and closing the door behind him. Once the heavy thud of the door echoed through the stone corridor, Kale exhaled slowly, his breath still shaky from the kiss. His pulse was still racing, but the moment was gone, replaced by the quiet, unnerving weight of the situation. What had just happened? And more importantly, where would it lead? Raina didn't speak at first, and for a moment, they simply stood there in the dim light, the tension between them palpable. Kale opened his mouth to say something, but words failed him. His mind was still trying to make sense of what had just occurred, what it meant, what she wanted, and what he had agreed to do. Raina, however, seemed to know exactly what she wanted to say. She took a step toward him, her expression now unreadable. "You should go back to your duties," she said, her voice colder now, more distant. "We're not done here, but we can't be seen like this." Kale blinked, his heart sinking. He had thought, hoped, maybe there was something more to this, but her words hit him like a cold slap. Of course, there couldn't be anything more. She was the leader of the Beastkin, and he was her prisoner. The kiss had been a moment of weakness, nothing more. He nodded silently, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. Raina's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, as if she, too, was trying to make sense of what had happened. But she turned away quickly, her expression returning to its familiar mask of command. "I'll arrange for your release from this cell soon," she said as she moved to the door. "I need you for something important." Kale wanted to ask what that something was, but the words got caught in his throat. She was already opening the door, her back to him as she slipped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her, and Kale was left standing in the silence. His heart was still beating erratically, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. He didn't know what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. An abrupt end to the one moment of connection they had shared. The next few days felt like a blur. Raina's presence was rare, and when she did come by, she was always cold, her interactions with him distant, almost like nothing had changed between them. She kept him on a short leash, giving him tasks to do, but never once acknowledging the bond they had momentarily shared. Each time she came to speak to him, her gaze would flicker briefly to his lips, but she would quickly look away, as if that moment had never happened. Kale, for his part, couldn't stop thinking about it. He tried to focus on the tasks she assigned to him, small errands around the compound, moving supplies, and occasionally working with some of the lower-ranking beastkin, but his mind was never far from Reyna. Her absence gnawed at him. She had asked for his help, but now that they had shared something intimate, something human, why was she retreating? It didn't make sense. One afternoon, when Kale was alone in his cell, his thoughts spiraling once again, the door opened without warning. Kale froze, expecting another guard. But when he saw Reyna standing in the doorway, his heart skipped a beat. She was back, but this time her expression was different. There was no coldness, no mask. Her eyes were dark, heavy with something unreadable. "Come with me," she said softly, her voice low and almost tentative. Kale stood quickly, his legs stiff from the long hours of confinement. As he moved toward her, his pulse quickened. Was this it? Was this finally the moment they would speak openly about what had transpired? Reyna didn't wait for him to ask questions. She turned and walked briskly down the hall, and Kale followed her, his heart racing with uncertainty. What had she meant by this? Why was she suddenly inviting him to follow her when she had been so distant? They walked in silence, the corridors growing darker as they moved deeper into the heart of the compound. The further they went, the more tense the air seemed to become. Reyna wasn't speaking, and Kale was too afraid to break the silence. He could sense the weight of something hanging between them, something unresolved, something unspoken. Finally, they arrived at a small room, far from the guards' usual patrols. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, Kale felt the change in the atmosphere. The tension between them had shifted again. There was no mistaking it now. Reyna had brought him here for a reason. Reyna turned to face him, her back against the door. She hesitated for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts, before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've made a decision," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I need you to trust me." Kale's heart skipped a beat. The words, though simple, were loaded with meaning. Trust her? After everything that had happened, after the kiss, the distance, could he really trust her? "I'm not sure what you want from me anymore," Kale admitted, his voice unsteady. "You asked for my help, but now you're pulling away." Reyna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and something else. A longing, perhaps? Kale couldn't be sure. "You don't understand," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I need you, but not just as a prisoner. I need you to help me in ways I can't explain yet. There are things at play that you don't know about, things that threaten everything I've worked for. And you're the only one who can help me stop them." Kale's breath caught in his chest. This was it, the reason she had brought him here. He didn't know what this new mission would entail, but he couldn't deny the weight of her words. The time for questions was over. Kale stood there, his mind racing as Reyna's words hung in the air between them. She needed his help, but not in the way he had expected. Not as a mere captive or pawn in her schemes. There was something deeper, something more urgent in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "I don't understand," Kale murmured, his voice hoarse. "What do you need me to do? Why me?" Reyna took a deep breath, her gaze softening just for a moment before she regained her usual composure. She looked around the room as if ensuring that they were alone, then moved closer, her presence suddenly filling the small space between them. "Not here," she said, her voice low, filled with a quiet intensity that made Kale's pulse quicken. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door. Kale followed, his thoughts swirling. He had no idea where they were going or what Reyna had planned, but his heart thudded against his chest in a mixture of fear and curiosity. Reyna led him down a narrow corridor, one he hadn't noticed before. It was darker than the rest of the compound, the air thick with a heavy, almost oppressive silence. The walls seemed to close in around them, making the journey feel all the more intimate. Kale could hear the soft shuffle of Raina's steps ahead of him, the faint scent of her presence filling the air. Her body moved with a fluid grace, her furred tail swaying gently behind her, a constant reminder of her beastly nature. Kale couldn't help but feel a certain unease, not only from the unfamiliar path they were walking, but also from the way her scent seemed to draw him in, making his thoughts scatter. There was something about her, something both intimidating and alluring, that he couldn't quite define. Despite everything, despite the conflict between them, his body reacted to her in ways he had no control over. They arrived at a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, its surface worn from years of use. Raina didn't hesitate as she pushed it open, revealing a room lit only by the soft glow of a few flickering candles. The air inside was cool, with a faint scent of herbs and something else he couldn't place. The room was sparse, just a few pieces of furniture, including a large table in the center covered with maps and scrolls. "This is where the decisions are made," Raina said quietly, her voice unusually calm now. "Where plans are laid. But there are things you don't know, things I haven't told you." Kale's eyes scanned the room. It was clear this was a space of importance, hidden away from prying eyes. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't meant to be seen by anyone else. He turned his attention back to Raina, who had already walked to the table, her fingers brushing lightly over the maps as she spoke. "There's a rebellion forming," she continued, her tone steady but with an edge of urgency. "Against me, against everything I've built. And it's not just other beastkin. There are humans involved. I need you to help me find them." Kale felt a chill run down his spine. "Humans? Why would they be working with your people?" "I thought." Raina looked up, her golden eyes flashing with an intensity that made Kale pause. "Because they're desperate. Because they believe that overthrowing me, overthrowing everything I've worked for, will give them power. But they don't realize what they're playing with. If they succeed, if they manage to get what they want, there will be chaos, war, and neither side will survive." Kale swallowed, trying to process what she was saying. The idea of working with Raina, of helping her, was unsettling. She was the leader of the beastkin, the very ones who had captured him and held him as a prisoner. And yet, in that moment, he could feel the weight of her words. There was a genuine fear in her eyes, a fear for something much larger than her own personal power. "How do you expect me to help you?" Kale asked, his voice tentative. "I'm just a prisoner. Why would anyone listen to me?" Raina gave him a small, tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Because they won't expect you. They won't see you coming. You're human, and that's your greatest advantage. You know how they think. You understand their weaknesses." Kale stared at her, uncertainty bubbling up in his chest. He didn't know if he could trust her, if this was some kind of manipulation, but he couldn't ignore the urgency in her voice. The way she had spoken just then, it sounded like she was fighting for something bigger than herself, something he could almost understand. "And what about you?" Kale asked, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand her role in this. "Why are you so sure this is the right move? Why not just fight them head on?" Raina hesitated, her gaze dropping to the map for a moment before she answered. "I'm not like them," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I can't just destroy everything in my path. I'm not like the others who would kill to maintain control. I want peace, Kale. I want us to find a way to work together, to stop this war before it even begins." There was a softness in her voice that Kale hadn't heard before, a hint of vulnerability he hadn't expected. Caught him off guard, making him take a step closer to the table. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her. But after everything that had happened, after everything she had put him through, was it possible? Raina looked up at him again, and for the first time, Kale saw the weariness in her eyes. The weight of leadership, the burden of keeping everything together, was etched into her features. She wasn't just a beastkin leader. She was someone who had carried the weight of an entire people on her shoulders. And now, she was asking for help. "Please," Raina said, her voice softening further. "Help me. We don't have to be enemies anymore. I need you." Kale's chest tightened at the desperation in her voice. He had always hated being a pawn in someone else's game, but this felt different. Reina wasn't just trying to control him. She was asking for his help, for something more than just physical assistance. She was asking him to trust her, to believe in something that wasn't just about power. Kale nodded slowly, his mind still whirling. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'll help, but I need to know more. What exactly do you need me to do?" Reina's gaze softened, and for the first time since they had met, she gave him a genuine smile. "You'll know soon enough," she said. "But first, we need to make sure no one else finds out about this. No one can know you're helping me." As she turned to gather the maps, Kale felt a flicker of hope stir within him. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something more than just a struggle for survival. Kale followed Reina as she led him through the winding corridors of the compound, her steps quick and purposeful. The urgency in her movements was unmistakable. This wasn't just about him helping her with her rebellion. It was something much deeper, and he could feel the weight of that unspoken truth pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he agreed to help her, but it was clear that this wasn't just another task in a long list of duties. Whatever had been growing between them, whatever they had started in that moment of intimacy, was about to take them both down a path they couldn't turn away from. The silence between them was thick with anticipation as they reached a large, dimly lit room at the back of the compound. The walls were lined with shelves of books and scrolls, each one meticulously organized but radiating a sense of secret knowledge. Kale couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as they entered, the room giving off an air of mystery, one that seemed to pulse with ancient power. Reina paused at the entrance, turning to face him. Her golden eyes were intense, her gaze unwavering. The cool, controlled exterior she had perfected was slipping, and Kale saw something raw and vulnerable flicker beneath the surface. "Stay here," she instructed softly, her voice almost a whisper as she moved toward a large table in the center of the room. Her hands hovered over a series of maps and documents spread across its surface, her movements slow and deliberate. Kale hesitated before stepping closer, his curiosity piqued. There were symbols and runes scattered across the papers, strange markings he couldn't recognize. Some looked like ancient scripts, while others were more familiar military strategies, troop movements, and the occasional diagram of the compound's layout. "I need you to study these," Reina said, glancing back at him. Her voice was soft, but the command was clear. "There are secrets here. Secrets I can't fully decipher on my own. I need your insight, your understanding of human strategy." Kale's brows furrowed. "I'm no expert in strategy, Reina, but I'll help however I can." Reina didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her attention back to the maps. Kale watched her carefully, noting how her fingers gently traced over the paper, lingering on certain areas as though the answers were hidden in the curves of the lines. There was a tension in her movements, something barely contained, and Kale couldn't help but wonder if the weight of the situation was finally getting to her. "These aren't just battle plans," Reina murmured, her voice barely audible. "They're a map to something older, something hidden. The rebellion, this war, isn't the only threat we face. There's something deeper at work here, something that's been lurking for years." She looked at him then, her gaze sharp. "The humans involved are only pawns in a much larger game. A game I'm still trying to understand." Kale felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean? What is this about?" Reina's gaze flickered to the table once more, her eyes scanning the diagrams and symbols as if they held the key to everything. "There's an artifact, one that could tip the balance of power in this entire world. If it falls into the wrong hands, everything could be destroyed. We have to find it before they do." Kale's mind raced. An artifact? What kind of artifact could be powerful enough to change the fate of the world? "And you think this artifact is in the hands of the rebellion?" Reina shook her head. "No, the rebellion is just a distraction. The true power is in those who seek the artifact. They've been working in the shadows for centuries, manipulating events to make sure it remains hidden. But now they think it's time to bring it into the open. And we can't let that happen. The room seemed to grow colder, and the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Kale's pulse quickened as the gravity of the situation finally sank in. He was no longer just a pawn in a political struggle. He was part of something much larger. This wasn't about just surviving anymore. It was about saving the world or destroying it. Raina moved closer to him, her expression still guarded, but with a flicker of something softer in her eyes. I don't trust many people, Kale, but I trust you. I need you by my side for this. Her words, once again, sent a ripple of confusion through him. She was still the same powerful, commanding leader he had first encountered. Yet the vulnerability in her voice now was something entirely new, something that made Kale's chest tighten. Despite everything that had happened, the betrayal, the power struggles, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward her, a connection that was becoming impossible to ignore. Where do we start? Kale asked, his voice steady, though his mind was still reeling. Raina's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. I'll take you to the vault. The artifact is kept there, but we need to get past the defenses first. There's a hidden passage, a secret way in that most of the guards don't even know about. Kale nodded, already feeling the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on him. He had agreed to help her, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. It was no longer just about playing his part in some larger scheme. It was about trust, about something he wasn't sure he fully understood yet, but couldn't deny. Raina turned and started for the door, but before she reached it, she paused, her back to him. And Kale, she said, her voice quiet, I don't want to lose you in this. Not after everything we've shared. Kale stood frozen, his heart skipping a beat. Her words hung in the air, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. The kiss, the moments they had shared, were now a lingering memory between them. Neither of them spoke of it, but it was there, hanging just beneath the surface. Raina took a breath and turned away, walking out of the room with a purpose. Kale followed, his heart pounding, his mind swirling with the weight of what lay ahead. He had made his choice. Now he had to see it through. They moved swiftly through the compound, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The closer they got to the vault, the more tense the air became. Kale's senses were heightened, every nerve on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than either of them could predict. As they approached the hidden entrance to the vault, Raina stopped, her hand resting on the stone wall. She turned to Kale, her expression serious, her eyes dark with determination. Once we enter, there's no turning back, she warned. Are you ready for this? Kale hesitated only for a moment before nodding. I am. With that, Raina pressed a hidden panel in the wall, and the stone shifted, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading deep underground. The air grew colder as they descended, and Kale couldn't help but feel that they were descending into the heart of something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The vault was close, and with it whatever secrets it held. The staircase seemed to stretch on endlessly, each step echoing in the silent, cold air. Kale's heart raced as they descended, the dim light from Raina's lantern casting long, wavering shadows along the stone walls. The further they went, the deeper they entered into the earth, into the very heart of the compound. Kale tried to steady his breath, but the tension in his chest wouldn't fade. He had agreed to help her, but now, as they neared the vault, he felt the full weight of that decision. He could still feel the weight of her words, still hear the raw vulnerability in her voice when she had asked for his trust. The trust he had given her now felt heavier than any chain. Beside him, Raina was a silent presence, her steps sure and deliberate. She didn't look back, but Kale could feel the pull of her energy, that silent strength that had drawn him in from the very beginning. Her golden eyes flickered in the dim light, her tail swaying behind her in time with her stride. It was a strange thing, feeling so drawn to someone who had once been his captor. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like their relationship was something new, something entirely separate from their past. There was a deeper connection now, one born from shared purpose, from understanding that there was something far more dangerous waiting for them. They finally reached the end of the staircase, where the walls gave way to a narrow hallway. Reyna paused at the entrance, turning toward Kale with a serious expression on her face. Her golden eyes gleamed in the low light, focused, determined. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "Once we enter, we'll be on their radar. We can't afford to waste any time." Kale nodded, his pulse quickening. "I'm ready." Reyna reached forward, pushing a large stone in the wall. There was a soft click, followed by a faint grinding sound as the hidden door slowly opened before them. Kale felt the air grow colder as they stepped inside. The room was vast, far larger than he had anticipated, filled with shelves upon shelves of ancient artifacts, some glimmering faintly in the dark, others covered in dust, untouched for years. The vault was a treasure trove of history and power. But it wasn't just the artifacts that caught his attention. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it a single item. Kale's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the object. A small, intricately carved box. It radiated an aura of power that Kale could feel in his bones, a subtle hum in the air that seemed to vibrate around him. Reyna stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the box. "There it is," she murmured almost to herself. "The artifact." Kale couldn't take his eyes off it. There was something about it, something undeniable. The energy coming from it was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Reyna turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We need to secure it, but we have to be careful. The vault isn't just protected by guards. It's protected by traps, by magic. This artifact has been hidden for centuries for a reason." Kale swallowed, his throat dry. "What kind of traps?" Reyna's eyes gleamed with a faint hint of concern. "Magical wards, mostly. Ones that would disintegrate anyone who gets too close without proper protection. We'll need to disable them before we can take the artifact." Without another word, she stepped forward, moving with a grace that belied the tension in the air. She gestured for Kale to follow. "Stay close, and don't touch anything." Kale nodded, his gaze shifting nervously to the shelves around them. The weight of the room was oppressive, as though the air itself held the secrets of 1,000 forgotten years. He couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls were watching them, that the vault itself knew they were there and was waiting for them to make a mistake. Reyna moved with purpose, her fingers tracing the edges of the pedestal. A soft glow appeared beneath her fingertips, the faintest shimmer of magic. Kale stood back, watching as she muttered something under her breath. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, the faintest spark of light dancing between her fingers as she worked. Finally, she stepped back, her expression focused but satisfied. "It's done," she said, her voice calm. "The wards are deactivated. We can take it now." Kale moved toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been working toward, the thing that could change everything. Reyna reached out, carefully lifting the box from its pedestal. As she did, Kale felt the air grow heavier, as though the room itself was reacting to the artifact's removal. A shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively stepped closer to her. The moment Reyna held the box, something shifted between them. Kale couldn't explain it, but it was as if the very act of touching the artifact had altered the dynamic between them. He watched as her fingers gently closed around the box, and in that moment, he saw the briefest flicker of something in her eyes, something more than just determination. There was a vulnerability there, something deeper, and for a fleeting second, their gazes met, holding in silence. Kale felt it too. Something was changing, and he wasn't sure whether it was the artifact or something more personal, something that had been building between them since the moment they had met. Reyna turned toward him, holding the box close to her chest. "We need to leave," she said, her voice low, almost hushed, as though the room itself might hear them. Now, before Kale could respond, a sudden sound broke through the silence. A sharp, echoing click reverberated through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Reyna's eyes widened in alarm. "They've found us." Kale's heart dropped into his stomach as he heard the unmistakable sounds of soldiers closing in. The vault doors were heavy, solid, but they wouldn't hold long. And with the artifact in their possession, there was no time to waste. Reina's eyes locked with his, the urgency clear in her gaze. We need to get out. Now. Without another word, she moved toward the far side of the vault, pulling him with her. Kale barely had time to process what was happening before they were running, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber as they searched for an escape route. As they moved deeper into the vault, the sound of the approaching guards grew louder. There was no way they could fight their way out of this. They needed to find the secret exit, if it even existed. Reina's breath was quick, her body tense beside him. Kale could feel her urgency, her desperation. And yet, as they ran through the winding hallways, side by side, he couldn't help but feel that something was different. The bond between them was growing stronger with each passing moment. It was no longer just about the artifact, it was about something far more dangerous, something they both had to survive together. The heavy footsteps of their pursuers echoed through the dimly lit corridors as Reina and Kale sprinted toward the hidden exit. The vault's air felt thick with danger, and Kale's chest tightened with each breath. The artifact, still cradled in Reina's arms, seemed to hum with a palpable energy, a power that seemed to ripple through the air around them. It was the key to everything, everything they had risked so much for. But now, as they neared the hidden escape route, Kale could sense that the danger was closing in from all sides. They were being hunted, and the only thing standing between them and certain capture was the dark labyrinth of passages they were racing through. Kale could hear the voices of the soldiers growing louder, their steps quickening in pursuit. There was no time to waste. Reina, we can't outrun them forever, Kale said, his voice strained, his pace faltering slightly as he glanced back over his shoulder. She glanced at him with a sharp, determined look, her golden eyes reflecting the urgency in the air. We don't need to outrun them. We need to lose them. She spoke quickly, her voice steady despite the situation. Trust me. Kale swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. He had already placed his trust in her once before, and despite the overwhelming danger they were in, he found himself ready to do so again. Something had shifted between them since their first encounter. Something unspoken and yet undeniable. The way her hand brushed against his, the way her breath came in soft, quick bursts when they ran side by side. It was as if they were connected by more than just their shared mission. They turned another corner, and Reina held up her hand, signaling for him to stop. The sudden halt nearly threw him off balance, but he quickly righted himself, watching as Reina pressed her ear to the stone wall, her eyes scanning the shadows with intense focus. For a moment, she was still, and Kale could almost hear the rapid beating of his own heart in the silence. We'll make our stand here, she said after a beat, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a narrow passage just ahead. If we can get to it before they catch up, we might be able to slip away. Kale nodded, his pulse quickening. It felt like they were racing against more than just time. With every passing second, the weight of what they were carrying, both the artifact and the implications of their bond, felt heavier. The stakes were too high to fail. Not now. Not after everything they had already been through. Reina stepped forward, her posture shifting, preparing for what was to come. Kale followed her lead, feeling the tension rise in the air. They couldn't afford to be caught, not with the artifact and their lives on the line. He moved closer to her, their shoulders brushing together as they stood side by side. Are you ready? Reina asked, her voice low, almost teasing in its undertone. As she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, Kale's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way she spoke, the slight smirk on her lips, that made him feel both nervous and strangely drawn to her. He wasn't sure if it was the danger, or the proximity, or something deeper, something more instinctual, but the tension between them crackled in the air, undeniable. He cleared his throat, his voice a little rougher than usual. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Reina nodded sharply, her expression turning serious once again. Stay close, and don't let go of me, no matter what. Before Kale could respond, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. The soldiers were almost upon them. Reina didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she grabbed Kale's hand and pulled him toward the narrow passageway she had mentioned. The walls around them seemed to close in as they ran, the dim light from Raina's lantern flickering as they turned sharply, ducking under low-hanging beams. Kale's breath hitched as he struggled to keep up, but Raina's grip on his hand was firm and unwavering, guiding him through the maze of twisting passages. They finally reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy iron door stood, half hidden in the shadows. Raina stopped, her eyes scanning the area quickly. "We need to go through here," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "This leads to the outer courtyard." Kale nodded, and without another word, he watched as Raina pressed a small, almost imperceptible button on the door's side. There was a soft click, followed by the grinding of metal on metal as the door slowly opened. They slipped through the narrow opening, emerging into the cool night air. Kale breathed in deeply, the crisp wind brushing against his face. It was a welcome change from the stale, oppressive atmosphere of the vault. But their relief was short-lived. Raina turned to him, her golden eyes intense in the low light. "We're not safe yet," she whispered. "We need to keep moving." Kale could feel the weight of her words pressing against him. He had been so focused on the escape, on getting to safety, that he had almost forgotten about the danger still lurking. The soldiers were not the only threat. The artifact they had just taken was far too valuable, and Raina had made it clear that there were forces far beyond the guards who would stop at nothing to reclaim it. They moved quickly through the courtyard, shadows flickering against the stone walls as they passed. Kale could hear the distant sounds of the soldiers scrambling, searching for any sign of them, but they seemed to be a step behind. For now, they were safe. Raina's hand still clutched his, and despite the danger, despite the tension that weighed heavily on his shoulders, he couldn't help but notice the way her fingers tightened around his. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them had fully acknowledged, but that was beginning to surface with each passing moment. It wasn't just the artifact they were both protecting. It was the connection that had started to grow between them, the unspoken trust, the way their bodies moved in sync as they ran, the way their hearts beat a little faster when they were near each other. The thought sent a shiver down Kale's spine, but before he could dwell on it, Raina glanced over at him, her eyes softening for a moment. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low, her breath coming in soft bursts. "But we need to talk. There are things you need to understand." Kale's heart thudded in his chest. He wasn't sure what she meant, but the look in her eyes told him that whatever was coming next would change everything. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation, and Kale found himself bracing for what was to come. As they continued their flight, the heavy weight of the future ahead of them loomed large. Kale and Raina reached the outskirts of the hidden enclave, the dense forest surrounding them offering a faint sense of respite. The path ahead was barely visible through the heavy underbrush, but Raina moved confidently, her steps steady as she led the way. Kale's mind raced, thoughts swirling as the weight of their journey, and everything that had transpired, settled heavily in his chest. The artifact they had stolen, a shimmering crystal of indescribable beauty, pulsed with a strange energy in Raina's hands. It seemed almost alive, a powerful force that they both sensed deeply, but which also filled Kale with unease. Raina had insisted it was necessary for their cause, and though Kale trusted her more with each passing day, he couldn't fully shake the feeling that they were only just beginning to understand the true consequences of what they had done. Raina's hand tightened around his for a brief moment, pulling him from his thoughts. "We're close now," she whispered, her voice soft, though there was an edge of tension beneath her words. Kale nodded, his heart still thudding in his chest. The journey had been grueling, and they both knew their enemies weren't far behind. The artifact wasn't just a thing to be kept safe. It was a symbol of everything they had come to risk for each other, everything that had changed between them in ways they hadn't fully acknowledged. He glanced at her, her features set in determination, though her eyes seemed to reflect something more fragile. She was strong, stronger than he had ever expected anyone to be, but there was something vulnerable in her that he couldn't ignore. She wasn't just a warrior, a leader. She was someone with her own burdens, her own desires, her own fears. and somehow he had become entangled in them, just as she had become tangled in his. Reyna led him to a small clearing, the dim light of dusk filtering through the trees above. The air was cool, but Kale could feel the warmth of her presence, the way their bodies naturally gravitated toward each other. He knew there was something between them, something that had started when she had first reached out to him. That spark of connection, however unexpected, had grown steadily, leaving him with a mixture of emotions: fear, desire, something deeper that neither of them had dared to name. They stood there for a moment, both silent, the weight of everything hanging between them. Kale felt the tension in the air, thick and undeniable. His breath was steady, but his pulse raced. The look Reyna gave him was soft but intense, as if she was studying him, trying to understand something that even he didn't fully comprehend. "We've come this far," she said softly, her words almost lost in the soft rustling of leaves. "But there's something I haven't told you, something important." Kale's brow furrowed slightly, and he took a small step closer to her, his heart thumping loudly in his chest. "What is it?" Reyna hesitated, her fingers playing absent-mindedly with the edge of her cloak, as if she were working up the courage to say whatever it was she needed to say. "The artifact we've been protecting, it's not just a tool. It's a key to unlocking something much bigger than we can understand. And the connection it creates between us?" She trailed off, her voice thick with something that Kale couldn't quite place. "A connection?" he asked, his voice low, the implication of her words sinking in. Reyna met his gaze, her golden eyes gleaming in the fading light. "It's a bond, Kale. A bond between us and the power that artifact holds. It's not just about keeping it safe anymore. We're linked to it in a way that can't be undone." Kale's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure what to make of her words, but he could feel the weight of them, the seriousness with which she spoke. The bond she referred to, their bond, wasn't just about the artifact or the mission. It was something deeper, something personal. A tether that had woven itself between them without either of them fully realizing it. "Reyna," he began, but she stopped him with a gentle shake of her head. "It's not just the artifact we need to worry about now," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "We've stirred something dangerous, and now there's no turning back. But I need you to understand that, even if it's too late to turn back, it doesn't change what this means for us." Reyna's words hung in the air between them, and Kale felt the full weight of them pressing against his chest. He wanted to say something to make sense of it all, but there was a growing tension inside him that didn't quite have a name. He reached out instinctively, brushing his fingers against her arm in an effort to convey something, anything, that could ease the uncertainty they both felt. Her eyes softened as she looked down at his hand, then back up to meet his gaze. "There's more I need to tell you," she whispered. "More than you think." Kale swallowed hard, taking a slow step closer, his hand now resting lightly on her shoulder. She didn't pull away, and instead, her eyes closed for a brief moment, as if she were gathering strength for something important. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bond between us, Kale, it's more than just shared danger or physical proximity. It's," she hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's a connection that goes beyond anything I've ever known, a connection I didn't expect." Kale's heart skipped a beat as the weight of her words settled in. He stepped even closer now, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "Reyna, are you saying that?" Her finger pressed to his lips, silencing him. For a moment, everything was still, the night air holding its breath, the rustling of the trees suddenly quiet. There was only the space between them, electric with the unspoken words and emotions that neither had dared to voice before. "I'm saying that you're more than just a part of this mission to me," Reyna said softly. "You've become something more. I just—" She trailed off again, her golden eyes clouded with something Kale couldn't quite understand. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps snapped them both out of the moment. Reyna's gaze hardened, and without another word, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a small hidden alcove between the trees. "Get down," she whispered urgently. Kale complied without question, feeling the heat of her touch lingering on his arm even as they crouched down together, hidden from view. They didn't speak as the shadows closed in around them, both of them waiting, breathing quietly, hearts racing in sync as they prepared for whatever came next. The world outside this brief, fragile moment was closing in on them, but for now, at least, they had each other. And that somehow was enough.